Okay, this is a video about Edith Hamilton, academic hero number 4. And sort of where I'm going with this is that there's a ton of stuff written about the ancient Greeks, and a lot of it is rather tedious and boring and goes into all the historical details. And I think what a person really wants if they're curious about the Greeks is what's the good stuff? What's the intellectually interesting stuff about their personality, about their philosophy? And the best spot to get that from is Edith Hamilton. She was a high school teacher of Greek and Latin in the 1800s and early 1900s, and then she retired and she started to write essays and books about the Greeks and the Romans. And she's a very entertaining, upbeat writer. Her most famous books are The Greek Way, which is a very good introduction to the Greeks and ancient Greeks, and Greek mythology. It's the best version of all the Greek mythology books. I've read a bunch of stuff on both of these subjects. If you wanted an introduction to Greek philosophy, philosophy in general, intellectual history, The Cave in the Light by Arthur Herman is a fantastic introductory book. So back to Edith Hamilton. She shows you sort of what was beautiful about the ancient Greeks. And she was so beloved and great at what she did that the city of Athens invited her to come to Greece, and they made her an honorary citizen. And she described that as being the highest moment of her entire life. So here's a quote from Edith Hamilton. Again, she lived from 1867 to 1963. She wrote, "The spirit of the West, the modern spirit, is a Greek discovery. The Greeks were the first Westerners." Okay, and Edith Hamilton continues, "The ancient world, insofar as we can reconstruct it, bears everywhere the same stamp. In Egypt, in Crete, in Mesopotamia, a despot enthroned whose whims are the determining factor, a wretched, subjugated populace, a great priestly organization to which is handed over the domain of the intellect. That is what we know as the Oriental state today. It has persisted down from the ancient world through thousands of years, never changing in any essential way. A tomb in Egypt and a theater in Greece. One comes to mind as naturally as the other." Okay, that's from Edith Hamilton on The Greek Way. So what's this all about? Basically, if a country is flat, it's very easy for one ruler to conquer the whole place and subjugate the entire population. Most countries ever since the beginning of recorded human history have been either serfdom or slavery. Sadly, that is sort of the average way things are usually run in the world. Okay, ancient Greek was unique. It was a bunch of mountainous areas, also surrounded by oceans, the different Greek islands, which enabled individualism to develop in these different Greek cities. And the most magnificent of all was Athens. And so and also they traded with other countries, being a seafaring country. The Greeks didn't have that great of a farmland. They did the best they could with what they had, but it led to tremendous intellectual development. Okay, the next quote from Edith Hamilton. "To rejoice in life, to find the world beautiful, was a mark of the Greek spirit, which distinguished it from all that had gone before." So yeah, in Egypt, art didn't change for over 1,000 years because there would be some ruler priest class that said you must do it this way, all this flat hieroglyphic type stuff, whereas in Greece the statuary was incredible. And it's too bad that we've lost a lot of the paintings, but one can see there was sort of a playful, joyful spirit and zest to the ancient Greeks. It's rather incredible. Lots of persons that have studied them have commented on this. I've studied a ton of history, and the ancient Greeks were incredible. Percy Bysshe Shelley, as I said it was the most fascinating time ever in the history of the world to study history, is from about 500 BC to about 300 BC amongst the ancient Greeks. It sort of sets the pattern for what we think of as a modern human mind in terms of their personality and behavior. We can relate very easily to it. And Edith Hamilton continues, "The fundamental fact about the Greek was that he had to use his minds. The ancient priests in other lands had said, 'Thus far and no further.' We set the limits of thought. But the ancient Greeks had said, 'No, all things are to be examined, all things called into question. There are no limits to be set on thought.' Freedom of the mind was born in Greece." And so one sees the Greeks had incredible debates. They had these ancient philosophers And one can see it wasn't just Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. There were the pre-Socratics, which were quite fascinating, like Pythagoras, Heraclitus. There's a whole bunch of them. They're quite interesting. So Edith Hamilton continues, Athens and Rome had little in common. The Greeks were the first intellectualists. The Greeks were the first people who played. They had Olympic Games and theater. The Romans did not play. The gladiator fights were not play. And so the point is made that the Romans sort of had more in common with a lot of these ancient dictatorships, and they were rather brutal. Whereas the Greeks, the Greeks had a negative side to them as well, but they had this tremendous positive side. The Romans conquered many populations. They were so impressed by the Greeks, they pretty much just adopted Greek literature and Greek theater and traditions. Cicero in particular, the greatest of the Romans, he went and translated a bunch of Greek books and just was fascinated by them. Edith Hamilton continues, a people's literature is a great textbook for real knowledge of them. The writings of the day show the quality of the people as no historical reconstruction can. So it's rather fascinating, the story of the ancient Greek books, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the histories of Herodotus. Really, Thucydides is much more interesting. It's extraordinary. And then my favorite of all the ancient Greeks was Aristotle. Aristotle sort of classified all the known knowledge of the world up to that time. And a lot of people who studied extensively consider him the smartest person who ever lived. It's rather incredible. But sadly, the thing is that a lot of Aristotle's original writings didn't quite get to posterity. They came up through student notes and whatnot, versus Plato had been more careful to make sure that his specific writings were preserved and incorporated into school programs early on. But anyways, Edith Hamilton continues. Myths are early science, the result of men's first trying to explain what they saw around them. And that's quite interesting. And that gets into things that were further explored by, for example, Robert Pirsig when he wrote Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. How man's mind, how the Greeks' ancient mind started to contemplate the universe and come to terms with it. And it's rather interesting stuff. Edith Hamilton continues, through Plato, Aristotle came to believe in God, but Plato never attempted to prove his reality. Aristotle felt that he had to do so. While Plato contemplated God, Aristotle produced arguments to demonstrate him. Plato never defined God, but Aristotle thought God through logically and concluded with entire satisfaction to himself that God was the unmoved mover. And by the way, the unmoved mover is still a valid argument for the existence of God. The Big Bang Theory is essentially the unmoved mover on a grand scale. And we talked about this before, the arguments and the data about the Big Bang, the electromagnetic wave pattern, the Doppler shift pattern show an expanding universe consistent with the Big Bang moment about 14 billion years ago. And then that life later was made about 4 billion years ago implies that it was a God that not only made the universe but came back. Okay, and there's very good scientific data to support that. If you're interested in that concept, Is Atheism Dead? The book by Eric Metaxas is the best one to briefly summarize that science. There's other books that more extensively go into detail on it. Okay, and here's our last quote today from Edith Hamilton. It always seems strange to me that in our endless discussions about education, so little stress is laid on the pleasure of becoming an educated person, the enormous interest it adds to life. To be able to be caught up in the world of thought, that is to be educated. So Edith Hamilton, she was a great educator, a great person, and she, was fluent in Greek and Latin, and she made available to many others all kinds of insights and whatnot. And her book, Mythology, is probably the best one for a beginner to start with if they're curious about it. It's the best of the mythology books. Her Greek Way is also very good if you're interested in studying the Greeks. I think the courses by thegreatcourses.com are reasonably good. You have to pick and choose through the details of them, but they have separate ones on the literature, separate ones on other aspects of ancient Greek life. Probably the literature, I think, is the most interesting and fun way to start, like the Greek plays and whatnot. So anyways, hope that's helpful.